Thank you for holding this conference and for including me, the non-physician, in this very esteemed group. I also want to take the opportunity to thank my husband, Dana, not because it's his birthday today, but because this is his story, not mine. And we'll talk about how that plays out over the course of the next few minutes. Some of you may know of Dana. You may even know Dana. We have spoken at a number of prostate cancer conferences from New York to Chicago to San Francisco to all over. And most people see his picture back when he had no hair during his treatment and say, "Oh, I recognize you from online." They're not really sure if he sold something or taught something, and then they realize he does work for the New York Times. He has since '93, and when he was diagnosed in 2008, he began to write about his prostate cancer. We'll talk about that. My first encounter with prostate cancer was as the oldest of three daughters 20 years ago when my dad was 70, and his doctor said, "Well, you don't fit the 55 to 69 profile, so just deal with it." He said, "Excuse me?" And the doctor said, "Well, you just turned 70, so..." And he said, "And so you're going to do nothing?" And the doctor said, "Well, you're 70. And he said, "Yeah, but I plan on living 30 more years, and I'm still working full-time, and I do this and this and this and this." And the doctor said, and made what he told us was a very generous decision in allowing my dad to have surgery 20 years ago. And it went well. It was a relatively benign, pardon the pun, prostate cancer. And he had some symptoms. But again, I was the oldest daughter, not his spouse, not his partner, there are things you don't want to talk about in front of your mom and dad. There are words you don't want to hear them say. And I didn't go to medical school, so it's taken me a long time to be comfortable. I even have to sort of force myself to say certain things, especially looking at a room full of people, many of whom are male. I was raised as a nice girl. I never thought I would get in front of a national audience and say penis or anything like that. I'm not even sure at the time I really knew about incontinence or erectile dysfunction. And again, it's your dad, la, la, la. So one of my sisters at the time was just about to turn 40 and pregnant with twins. So she wasn't doing a lot of the driving and helping. But my other sister and I made ourselves available when we could. We were married, we had jobs, we had little kids. But my mom said, we got this. And sure, I went to some appointments, but there were times when I said, I'm just going to step out and get a glass of water, because I wanted them to have the opportunity to talk about things that I didn't think we really needed to be involved in. Long story short, my dad died 13 years later of a completely different disease, and he was always glad that he had had that particular surgery for that particular disease. The brief history of me as Dana's wife: we met in 1980. We got engaged 10 days later. Hey, it worked. We're still together. We are from very, very different backgrounds. I added the second very because last night I got back from 5 days in rural New Hampshire where I was taking care of his two parents, and our backgrounds are very different. 6 months after we married, Dana got very sick. And another long story short, he was diagnosed with a very difficult case of ulcerative colitis. So in the early 80s, he had a number of surgeries. We were in our early 20s. This was not what we really thought we were saying in sickness and in health, because you don't really think of the sickness part when you're that young. But I realized right away, as he had his large intestine removed and his, again, I learned to say words back then too, his anus removed and his rectum removed and this removed and that removed. And I realized right away we were a team. He was a great patient. He was in a wonderful hospital in Manhattan. And all he wanted, of course, this is in the 80s, so I don't really have to remind you all the things that weren't available. All he wanted was a couple of newspapers and a couple of books. He didn't want anybody coming in or out of his room and fluffing his pillows and asking if he was in pain or anything like that. And then I just did my thing of taking care of everything else. Then everything was fine. After a couple of years of this, he got healthy. He wasn't supposed to live. He did. He had a career. He ran marathons. He wrote books. We had 2 sons. Everything was great. And then when he was 50, prostate cancer. So I thought about, well, what am I going to talk about with you? I'm certainly not going to talk about cancer. You've got doctors, specialists, people who know everything there is to know about prostate cancer. I don't know so much, and I know way less than I knew back when he was diagnosed. I'm not a medical professional. I'm not a technician or a nurse. I'm not a physician. I can't talk about testing or diagnosing treatment plans. I can't prescribe meds. I can't even do research. So I thought, well, what am I going to do? I mean, okay, I can drive him to some places, but prostate cancer doesn't necessarily mean you can't drive. So how am I going to help? I thought there are other people who know all about the stages of the disease and things they're going to talk to us about. So I went back into what I had been doing in the 1980s when he was first sick and said, I need to learn about this stuff. And thought what I would do today is really talk about you, meaning the people. Now, you're all different. We're all different, obviously. But I know a little bit about what you might want to call the journey. Some people don't like that word. The relationship. Some people don't like that one. The battle. My husband can't stand that one. He doesn't like, so-and-so died after a long battle with. He's like, no, that means you lost. He said, it's bad enough I died. I don't want to also be a loser. So, that's just his thing. Lots of my friends who've had cancer said, I'm battling breast cancer or I'm battling thyroid cancer. So whatever you want, you get to call it. You're in it, though. You wouldn't be here if you weren't in it. You might be the patient. You might be the relative of a patient. You might be the loved one, although I guess sometimes relative is loved one, but you know what I mean. There's a reason that you're here. You could be a caregiver. You might not be a family member. But your role with prostate cancer is going to be very different depending on how comfortable you are and how competent. So some things might not be for you. I'm pretty sure if I were sick, I would not write a blog. I'm not a writer. That's not how I deal with things. That's not how I solve things. And I'm happy to help other people, but talking about the personal and private functions of my body that no longer work and having everybody know. Remember, we have 2 sons. This was a while ago. Our kids were younger than they are now. I had a full-time job. There were people I dealt with every day, including hundreds of teenagers who had access to this information. Now, no one ever said in class, hi, Mrs. Jennings, I heard that your husband can't get it up anymore. But I knew that they had access to reading this, and so did their parents. So he was very careful, and he talked to me and he talked to our boys before he began to write the blog. And he said, are there things you don't want me to say? And our boys said, no, it's privates. That's not exactly what they said, but, they were boys. And I said, there's one thing that I can think of I'd rather not have people in the neighborhood know. And he said, great, that's off limits other than that. There are other things that may or may not be for you. I'm a huge fan of support groups. I'm sure there are other people here that can talk about that much more than I can. And I thought right away, first thing is we'll go to a support group. So we went to one in 2008 at the hospital where we were, where we lived. And that particular support group really didn't help. The person running it was phenomenal, but we looked around the room, and Dana was told, bring your spouse if you have one. So I came along. We were 50. We were working full time. We had 2 little kids, et cetera, et cetera. There was nobody in the room who brought his spouse, significant other, sister, daughter, brother, friend at all. There was nobody who was still working. There was nobody under 70. There was, like the doctor mentioned earlier, there were several people who said, it's nobody else's business. One guy said, I have 2 sons. They're both oncologists. They don't need to know my business. Now, that's his prerogative. I can't imagine having that kind of access to that kind of resource in someone who supposedly adores me that I've given birth to and not accessing that. So you get the picture. That particular support group wasn't for us. You need to work to find what it is that's best for you. I knew from Dana's earlier illness that he was a good patient, and I was a good caregiver. I don't know what will happen if those roles are ever switched. I don't know what's worse, the thought of him as a caregiver or me as a patient. But we haven't had to deal with that. So I told him that his job was to focus on getting better, and I'd do everything else. Not everybody has a person in his life who's able to do that or willing to do that. So there are different roles, even as a patient, that you may have to take on. How do you do that? If you're the patient, how do you focus on getting better? If you are the caregiver, the advocate, the helper, the family member, the friend, how do you help? What I have learned is that what you do and how you deal with what the doctor has told you and how you deal with one another and with yourself and with your diagnosis depends in part on everything that's already established in your life. That could be your level of education. That could be your family structure. That could be how comfortable you are with sharing personal things. It could be where you are in your life, not just how old you are, but whether you're working or not, and who else in your family is involved, and just your personal strengths and weaknesses. One of my sisters asked, when I got home from New Hampshire, as I mentioned, what are you doing tomorrow for Dana's birthday? And I said, I'm going into Manhattan to speak at a prostate cancer conference. And she said, oh God, my worst nightmare. And I said, no, for me, dentist is the worst nightmare. But if you say to me, hi, I just met you. In 5 minutes, I need you to speak to 500 people, and I'll give you the topic when you get on stage. I say, okay. That's not everybody. That's not my husband. That's not my sisters. That's not most people that I know. So what are you comfortable doing? What can you do for yourself or for the person that you're supporting who's been diagnosed with prostate cancer? And who else do you need to be part of that team? So are you the type of person who's going to focus on big picture issues? For us, the biggest picture was, will Dana live or not? Now, we're all dying. I mean, obviously, we're all going to die. But given his particular diagnosis and his age and his, I love this phrase, altered anatomy, which is what a lot of the doctors referred to, he had a 15% chance of living 3 years. He's still alive. So, yeah, woo! Okay. This was in 2008. 15% chance, as statistically accurate as one can be. Nobody's a magician. But that was something that we were not expecting. So life or death. Now, the altered anatomy can be really, really funny. As soon as his physician did the PSA and said, you're 50, there's no history of prostate cancer in your family, but this is a little high. We'll redo it in a week and then see. And it was even higher in a week. And he sent him to a urologist. And the urologist, I made the appointment because that's what I do. And the urologist said, well, first we'll have a DRE and blah, 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 blah. And I wrote everything down. And then I looked it all up. DRE, digital rectal exam. I didn't think I'd say rectal in public either. Well, if you don't have an anus or a rectum, you can't have a digital rectal exam. Imagine the doctor's surprise. So Dana didn't want to say anything. He's like, well, he'll just find out when and I said, Dana, you can't surprise a urologist. You have to explain. So I said, excuse me, I'm sorry, can I just say something? Of course, the doctor handled it like a professional. He wasn't all giggly and nervous like I was. And he said, okay, well, there are other things. But that happened as well when they had to go do the biopsy, when they had to go do the surgery. There were lots of things, scar tissue inside and out, really the least of them. Those were really the only things that I could think about. So are you focusing on the big picture? Again, it depends, as far as I can tell, on what you were already like. Or are you focusing on the details? And if you're focusing on the details, are you focusing on how those play out? So I've heard a lot of people, male and female, and now that I'm well, you know exactly how old I am since I said when we were 50. But okay, in our 60s, a lot of people talk about getting up during the night. For both his reasons, his prostate cancer and its treatment, and that previous surgery, which was a whole different thing where you have to learn to discuss voiding, he's been wearing a plastic bag on the outside of his body since we were in the early 20s. He gets up plenty of times a night. He goes right back to sleep. I don't hear a thing. Now, both of my sisters, if their husbands got up once during the night, that'd be it. They'd be out the rest of the night. So there are lots of things to think about. There's a difference between living in a studio apartment with somebody, and not that I've ever had this, but, living in a 7-bedroom house. There's room to say, go in the guest room. You're waking me up. I can't sleep. There are all kinds of practical things to think about. So what I think is most important is finding someone who can do the following things. It might be you, who's the patient. It might be the person who's here with you today if you've brought someone or that someone's brought you. It might be a bunch of people. You might know someone who's good at some of these things or who enjoys doing some of these things, but not all of them. First thing I did, reached out to every person I could possibly imagine who could be a contact. My son's college roommates, friends, parents who have an apartment they hardly ever use right near Sloan Kettering. What if we had to go there and we might need a night? We could never afford a hotel in the... Calling people. Keeping records. I'm super crazy organized. Most important is not just the organization, getting things in writing. Even if you think you remember, you don't know where this process, journey is going to take you and the things that you're going to need. I'll be honest, if you've read the blog, you know this already. We have 2 lovely, wonderful, amazing sons who are adults, who are married, who are great. I shouldn't say but. And one of them had 4 significant health issues during high school. You wouldn't know it to look at them, but on the inside, things aren't going super well. So when he got married and moved to San Francisco, I said, here are your binders. Left lung, right lung, this other issue, liver issue, here are your binders. These are now yours. I didn't say the day you turn 21 or whatever, but you're married, you're moving far away. Mommy's not taking you to the doctor anymore like I did before you could drive. And those are things that have come in handy. Doctors kind of like that, I've found. They're like, ooh, she's organized. Because they'll say, when did you have your last... Psh, here it is. I can't access this test. Do you have a copy? Psh, here it is. So having somebody who can do that, scheduling appointments. If you are, I know it's different now that there are cell phones, but if you're working, you may not have a space where you're comfortable calling. Maybe you don't want people to know. Maybe you don't want people to hear, even if they do know. Sharing certain things with certain people. I'm sure you're all familiar with websites like Caring Bridge and things like that. We didn't want to do it that way. I used either text messages or emails, depending on need to know. The people with whom Dana worked, they didn't need to know so much. Whether it was my sisters or our son, they needed to know a different level. And just giving them updates. People are caring, they're concerned. They don't want to hassle you and say, what's new? Because it doesn't always sound great. What's new means, what's going on with your diagnosis and your treatment. Research. I never pretended to know what was going on, but I made sure that I knew the words. So I don't know how to do a digital rectal exam, but I needed to know what DRE is. So if a doctor ever said that again, I could go, not happening. Just doing research, knowing things. I mean, I'd love to pretend that I understood the difference between cryotherapy and HIFU, and it's super interesting to me. But you have doctors for the important information, and you just need to research other things. Being Dana's voice during appointments, I knew that he's very introspective. I'm the outgoing one. Doctor says something, he's thinking for a long time. The doctor's on the next thing, and meanwhile, I've written it down, and I can show it to him later. Providing interference. To this day, Dana loves to make people laugh by saying, I'm sorry, I can't. My cancer. Now, that could be a party he doesn't want to go to, walking the dog, taking out the garbage, whatever. I can't. And he does it anyway, but it just, people will be over and they find it amusing. Now, there's nothing amusing about cancer, but being able to provide interference and say, sorry, we can't go. And luckily, my best friend is a physician, as is her husband, and they have 3 sons, 2 of whom are married. He missed both of their older sons' weddings. He just wasn't up to making the trip and doing it. And I said, he just can't. And they said, that's fine. So no big deal. And finally, asking other people for help. No fun. I like to think, no fun. I mean, people want to help. If you can say specifically, I'm going to lose my job if I drive him to all 33 radiation appointments. Could you take him on Tuesdays? He had a friend who had lost, because this was 2008, so he had a friend who had lost his job who was thrilled. He drove him over an hour each way twice a week and was super happy to be able to help. So those are just a few of my ideas from our process or our journey, not our battle. But I will tell you the 3 things that I wish I'd known. And there isn't much for me because we had that other big medical issue when we were so young. I wish I'd known that Dana would be surprised by so much. He is super bright. He can interview anybody and remember everything. But when you're the patient and someone says you have cancer and you hear what's going on with you, you focus on certain things. So he didn't remember being told certain things. He loves, again, it's not that funny, but it sounds it when I tell you these things. If any of you remember back to 1994, if you happen to watch Seinfeld, and there was the whole out in the Hamptons thing with shrinkage. Okay, some of you are giggling, so you know. So, Dana will say from time to time, more back closer to his diagnosis than now, no one ever told me that my penis was going to be so little. I said, yes, he did. Yeah, surgeon told you that. Yep, it's right here. I have it, line 3, indent number 4, bullet 17, penis will be smaller. that's not what he was focused on at the time. So I had to remember that he couldn't hear all of those things. When I picked him up at the hospital after his surgery, again, I'm organized, I think ahead, but I didn't realize how affected he would be by me having a hefty garbage bag and then a towel on the front seat. It was a long drive home. I knew about the incontinence. He's like, well, they're not talking about that kind of incontinence. They just mean like maybe if I'm sneezing and laughing really hard sometime, it might be. I said, no. So there are things that he just didn't realize, and that's something I wish I had known. The second is how often we'd be affected by what other people would say. And I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. I think most people are super helpful, super friendly, and super well-meaning. But there were 3 categories that really got me. One is, I'm not your doctor. I've never been to medical school. I've never had prostate cancer. I don't know anyone who's had prostate cancer, but, and then they tell you what to do. Maybe if you stood on your head and ate a lemon through your... Like, I don't really care. I'm convinced that we have really good doctors and they're telling him what his options are. That's not one of them. It's not helpful. The second, and I know what they mean is I believe that the survival rates for prostate cancer are probably better than some other things like XYZ cancer. But when they say, at least you have a good cancer, you're lucky. Not sure any cancers are good. Don't feel so lucky right now. And then the third, and maybe Daryl remembers this in the comments in the Well blog, because I know Daryl was one of the thousands of people who made comments. His, of course, were all positive and helpful. But people said, well, cancer's the kind of disease that one brings on oneself, and perhaps if you had taken care of yourself, Mr. Jennings. And I'm thinking, he just turned 50, he's a vegetarian, he runs marathon, like, what else could he have done? Now, that's not the first time I've heard that, and it's not usually prostate cancer. I have a friend whose mother said that if she hadn't worn such a tight bra when she was in high school, she wouldn't have gotten breast cancer. I mean, really, people? If you want to talk about that stuff, fine, but don't say it to somebody who's just been diagnosed. It's just not right. And then the last thing, which is a repeat from what I mentioned, but I have to go out with this, is the thing that I wish I'd most known in 2008 when we started this is that Dana would still be alive today. Thank you very much.